Sometimes the people we overlook become the very ones who save us. In a world that judges by appearances, true love often hides behind the faces society chooses to ignore. Silas McGraw was the loneliest mountain man in Montana Territory. When the wealthy Whitmore family offered him their plainest daughter Lydia in marriage, everyone expected disaster. The townsfolk called her the ugliest girl in 3 counties. But as Silas and Lydia headed into the harsh mountains together, something unexpected began to happen. Through winter storms and dangerous outlaws, through family betrayal and frontier hardships, they discovered that real beauty has nothing to do with looks. Their partnership would grow stronger with every challenge they faced. What could this unlikely pair teach an entire town about the true meaning of love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1873 painted the Montana Territory in shades of gold and crimson, and nowhere was this more evident than in the bustling frontier town of Prosperity Creek. Nestled between rolling hills and backed by the towering Rocky Mountains, the settlement had grown from a mining camp into a proper town. Over the past decade, false-fronted buildings lined the main street, their weathered wood bearing witness to harsh winters and scorching summers. The sound of hammers rang from the blacksmith's forge, mixing with the creak of wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of horses navigating the rutted dirt road. It was on such a morning that Silas McGraw rode into town, his pack-horse laden with enough beaver pelts and bear hides to turn every merchant's head. At 42, Silas cut an imposing figure even by frontier standards, standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders broadened by years of swinging an axe and hauling traps. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had learned to trust only himself. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver, hung past his collar, and his full beard bore the same distinguished threading of gray. But it was his eyes that marked him as different from other mountain men. Deep brown and thoughtful, they held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. Hidden beneath his worn leather coat, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, lay his most treasured possession, a leather-bound journal that had accompanied him through 15 years of solitary mountain living. Its pages held pressed wildflowers, detailed sketches of elk and eagles, and philosophical musings written by firelight. The journal revealed what few suspected, that beneath Silas McGraw's mountain man exterior beat the heart of a poet, a man who found beauty in small things and recorded his thoughts with the careful penmanship of someone who valued words. The townsfolk watched from doorways and windows as Silas guided his horses down Main Street toward Harrison's trading post. Whispered conversations followed in his wake, not unfriendly, but certainly curious. Most knew of Grizzly McGraw by reputation, the hermit who appeared twice yearly with prime furs and enough gold dust to buy supplies for months. He never caused trouble, paid his debts, and minded his own business. Yet something about his solitary existence fascinated the married women and puzzled the men who couldn't fathom choosing isolation over community. At the far end of Main Street, where the businesses gave way to residential lots, stood the Whitmore mansion, a 3-story testament to the wealth that could be extracted from Montana's mountains. Built of imported brick and adorned with carved wooden trim, painted pristine white, it dominated the landscape like a transplanted piece of Eastern civilization. Behind its tall windows and manicured gardens lived Ezra Whitmore, his wife Margaret, and their 3 daughters. The Whitmore name carried weight in Prosperity Creek. Ezra owned the largest share in 3 different mines, held the mortgage on half the businesses in town, and served on the town council. His eldest daughter, Victoria, had married the territorial judge's son in a ceremony that had been the social event of the decade. His middle daughter, Caroline, was engaged to a railroad executive from Denver and spent her time planning a wedding that would rival Victoria's. Both young women possessed the kind of classical beauty that frontier men wrote poetry about, golden hair, blue eyes, and the refined manners that came from Eastern finishing schools. But it was the third daughter who concerned Ezra Whitmore. As he stood in his study that morning, gazing out at the mountain man securing his horses at the trading post, Lydia Margaret Whitmore, 26 years old and still unmarried, represented what polite society considered a problem. Not because of any failing in character or intelligence. Indeed, Lydia possessed both qualities in abundance. The issue, as the town's matrons whispered behind gloved hands, was her appearance. A childhood bout with smallpox had left Lydia's face marked with faint scars, visible enough to be noticed in an era that prized unmarked skin above all else. Her hair, while thick and lustrous, was a plain brown rather than the fashionable gold of her sisters. Her figure, though strong and capable, lacked the tiny waist and delicate constitution that men seemed to prefer. Most damning of all, Lydia stood nearly 5 feet 8 inches tall, making her tower over most of the eligible bachelors in their small community. What the town's gossips failed to recognize, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that Lydia Whitmore possessed qualities far rarer than mere physical beauty. She could calculate figures in her head faster than most men could do on paper, having helped manage her father's business ledgers since she was 16. She spoke fluent French and German, read voraciously, and could identify every medicinal herb that grew in the surrounding mountains. Her garden produced the finest vegetables in 3 counties, and her preserves were sought after by every household in town. More importantly, Lydia possessed something her beautiful sisters lacked entirely: genuine kindness. While Victoria and Caroline moved through town like gracious queens, acknowledging their subjects, Lydia stopped to help elderly Mrs. Henderson with her shopping, read stories to the children at the schoolhouse, and never failed to visit families when sickness struck. The town's working women, if asked privately, would admit they preferred Lydia's company to that of her more celebrated sisters. On this particular morning, Lydia stood in the kitchen of the Whitmore mansion, directing the preparation of preserves, while simultaneously reviewing the household accounts. Her practical brown dress was protected by a spotless white apron, and her hair was pinned back in a simple but neat arrangement. She moved with efficient grace, checking the temperature of the preserving kettles while making notes in a leather-bound ledger. "Miss Lydia," called Sarah, the young Irish maid who helped in the kitchen, "there's quite a stir in town this morning. That mountain man, the one they call Grizzly, he's back with enough furs to buy half the territory." Lydia looked up from her ledger, curious despite herself. She had seen Silas McGraw during his previous visits to town, though always from a distance. Something about his quiet dignity had caught her attention. The way he moved through the crowds, without seeming to notice the attention he drew. "Sarah, you shouldn't listen to gossip," Lydia said gently, though she found herself walking to the window that overlooked Main Street. From her vantage point, she could see the tall figure of the mountain man as he negotiated with old Harrison over the price of his furs. Even at this distance, there was something compelling about Silas McGraw's presence. Unlike the other rough men who frequented the trading post, he carried himself with a quiet authority that suggested hidden depths. His movements were deliberate and economical, speaking to someone who had learned to waste neither motion nor words. As if sensing her observation, Silas glanced up toward the Whitmore mansion. For just a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Lydia felt an unexpected flutter of something she couldn't quite name. There was no mockery in his gaze, no pity or dismissal, just a steady, thoughtful regard that made her feel seen, in a way she rarely experienced. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, with Silas returning his attention to his business and Lydia stepping back from the window, her cheeks warm with embarrassment at being caught staring. "Miss Lydia?" Sarah's voice held a note of concern. "Are you feeling well? You look flushed." "I'm fine, Sarah, just the heat from the stoves," Lydia replied, though she made no move to return to the preserving kettles. Unknown to Lydia, Her father had also noticed the mountain man's arrival, and his attention was focused not on the quality of Silas's furs, but on something far more calculating. Ezra Whitmore was a man who saw opportunities where others saw only circumstances, and as he watched Silas McGraw conduct his business with quiet competence, an idea began to form in his mind. The idea would change everything, for better and for worse. But for now, it remained just a thought, germinating in the mind of a desperate man who had built his reputation on making profitable deals, regardless of the human cost. As the morning sun climbed higher over Prosperity Creek, casting long shadows between the buildings, none of the three principals in this developing drama could have imagined how their lives were about to become irrevocably intertwined. Silas continued his methodical trading, Lydia returned to her domestic duties, and Ezra Whitmore began sketching the outline of a plan that would shock the entire town before the week was through. 3 days after Silas McGraw's arrival in Prosperity Creek, Ezra Whitmore made a decision that would scandalize the town and forever alter the course of 3 lives. The decision came not from paternal love or even basic human decency, but from the cold calculations of a man staring into the abyss of financial ruin. Hidden beneath the polished veneer of the Whitmore mansion's prosperity lay a truth that Ezra had managed to conceal from even his own family. The mines that had made him wealthy were playing out, producing barely enough ore to cover operating expenses. Worse still, he had leveraged his properties and businesses to invest in a railroad venture that had collapsed spectacularly, leaving him with crushing debts that would soon come due. The monthly payments to Eastern creditors were eating away at what remained of his capital like acid through metal. Ezra sat in his mahogany-paneled study, staring at the formal document that had arrived with the morning mail. The marriage contract lay spread across his desk, its official seals and legal language, representing what he had convinced himself was a brilliant solution to multiple problems. The document bore the signatures of witnesses and had been prepared by the territory's most expensive attorney, though its contents would have horrified anyone with a shred of decency. The contract was deceptively simple in its language, offering Lydia Margaret Whitmore in marriage to Silas McGraw in exchange for a substantial monetary consideration. But hidden within the legal terminology were clauses that revealed Ezra's true intentions. Upon marriage, Lydia would retain certain property rights that would revert to her family in the event of her husband's death or disappearance. More tellingly, the contract granted the Whitmore family advisory rights over any land or mineral claims acquired during the marriage. Ezra had done his research on Silas McGraw, and what he had discovered filled him with a greed that overrode any concern for his daughter's welfare. The mountain man's trap lines covered territory that geological surveys suggested might contain gold deposits. More importantly, Silas had filed claims on several promising parcels of land, claims that a clever man might find ways to control through family connections. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and monstrous in its callousness. Marry off his unmarriageable daughter to the wealthy mountain man, then use family influence to gain access to his resources. If Silas proved difficult to manipulate, well, the wilderness was dangerous, and mountain men sometimes simply disappeared. Either way, the Whitmore family would emerge from their financial crisis stronger than ever. What Ezra had not counted on was his daughter's intelligence or her ability to read people and situations with startling accuracy. When he summoned Lydia to his study that afternoon, she entered with the quiet dignity that had always marked her interactions with a father who barely acknowledged her existence. "Lydia, sit down," Ezra commanded, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. "We need to discuss your future." Lydia settled into the chair with practiced grace, her hands folded in her lap and her expression carefully neutral. Years of living with her father's indifference had taught her to expect nothing good from such conversations. "I've arranged a marriage for you," Ezra announced without preamble, watching his daughter's face for any reaction. To Mr. McGraw, the mountain man, the ceremony will take place this Saturday. For a moment, the only sound in the study was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Lydia's expression didn't change, though something flickered briefly in her dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "I see," she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil that must have been raging beneath her calm exterior. "And what does Mr. McGraw think of this arrangement? He's agreed to it, naturally. No man would refuse such an advantageous match." Lydia's gaze moved to the contract on her father's desk, taking in its official appearance and formal language. Even upside down, she could read enough to understand that this was no simple marriage arrangement. "May I ask, what considerations influence this decision?" she inquired, her tone carrying just enough steel to let her father know she wasn't entirely naive about his motivations. Ezra cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with his daughter's direct questions. He had expected tears, protests, perhaps even grateful acceptance of any marriage offer. He had not expected this calm analysis of his motives. "Mr. McGraw is a wealthy man with substantial property holdings," he said, falling back on the explanation he had prepared. "You're 26 years old, Lydia. Your prospects for marriage in this town are limited. This represents security for your future." "And for yours," Lydia observed quietly, her eyes still fixed on the contract. "What exactly have you promised him, father? And what have you promised yourself?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Ezra preferred not to examine too closely. For a moment he saw his daughter not as the plain spinster he had always considered her, but as the intelligent woman she had become, despite his neglect. "The arrangements are none of your concern," he said finally, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "Your job is to be a dutiful wife to a good man who can provide for you." Lydia stood slowly, smoothing her brown wool dress with deliberate care. When she spoke again, her voice carried a dignity that shamed her father's machinations, though he was too consumed with his own problems to recognize it. "Very well, father. If Mr. McGraw truly wishes to marry me and understands what he's getting, a plain woman with no dowry beyond whatever schemes you've devised, then I accept. But I have conditions." Ezra blinked in surprise. "Conditions? I will be treated as a wife, not a business transaction. I will have a say in decisions that affect us, my life. And I will know the truth about whatever agreements you've made, because I refuse to enter a marriage built on deception." Before Ezra could respond, Lydia had already turned and walked from the study, leaving him alone with his contract and his guilt. He told himself that he was doing what was necessary for the family's survival, that Lydia would be better off married to a successful man than facing poverty as a spinster. But her questions had planted seeds of doubt that would grow more troublesome as the days passed. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away at the Frontier Hotel, Silas McGraw sat in his Spartan room, staring at his own copy of the marriage contract with a mixture of bewilderment and growing anger. Ezra Whitmore had presented the arrangement as a simple business proposition, an aging mountain man's need for a wife in exchange for a substantial payment and the promise of a woman who would ask no questions and make no demands. But as Silas read through the contract's fine print, he began to understand the true nature of the trap being set. The clauses about property rights and family advisory roles revealed Whitmore's real intentions as clearly as if they had been written in plain English. This wasn't a marriage arrangement. It was an elaborate swindle designed to separate him from his land and claims. What puzzled Silas was why Whitmore thought he would be foolish enough to fall for such an obvious scheme. Did the man really believe that 15 years of mountain living had turned him into a simpleton who couldn't read legal documents? Or was there something else at work here, some desperation that was driving Ezra Whitmore to attempt such a clumsy manipulation? As Silas pondered these questions, his thoughts kept returning to the woman who would supposedly become his wife. He had noticed Lydia Whitmore during his previous visits to town, had seen her kindness to children and elderly residents, had observed her quiet dignity in the face of her family's obvious indifference. She was not the beauty her sisters were, but there was something about her that suggested hidden depths. The idea of marriage had occurred to Silas more frequently in recent months. 15 years of solitary living had taken their toll, and he found himself longing for conversation that went beyond trading negotiations and weather observations. The thought of sharing his mountain home with someone who could appreciate its beauty, who might enjoy the books he had collected, and the philosophical discussions he missed from his youth held genuine appeal, but not like this. Not as part of some scheme to cheat him out of his hard-earned property, and certainly not with a woman who might be as ignorant of her father's true motives as Whitmore clearly expected Silas to be. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Silas made a decision that would surprise everyone involved in Ezra Whitmore's elaborate deception. Instead of confronting Whitmore directly or simply leaving town as a sensible man might do, Silas decided to pay a visit to the woman who was supposedly eager to become his wife. The decision would prove to be the first step in a chain of events that would transform a cynical business arrangement into something neither Silas nor Lydia could have imagined. A partnership built on honesty, respect, and eventually a love deeper than either had thought possible. The knock at the Whitmore mansion's front door came just after 7 o'clock, when the family was finishing their evening meal in the formal dining room. Sarah, the young Irish maid, hurried to answer it, her eyes widening when she found the tall mountain man standing on the front porch, hat in hand, and wearing what appeared to be his finest clothes: clean buckskin pants, a pressed white shirt, and a dark wool jacket that had seen better days, but spoke of respect for the occasion. "Good evening, miss," Silas said, his deep voice carrying the careful politeness of a man who understood social conventions, even if he rarely practiced them. "I'd like to speak with Miss Lydia Whitmore if she's available." Sarah bobbed a quick curtsy too, flustered to do more than gesture for him to wait while she hurried to the dining room. The conversation that followed was conducted in urgent whispers, but Silas's keen hearing caught the gist of it. Surprise, confusion, and what sounded like Ezra Whitmore's irritated voice demanding to know what the mountain man was doing at his door. It was Lydia herself who appeared in the front hallway, having excused herself from the family's bewildered questioning. She had changed from her afternoon dress into a simple but elegant evening gown of deep blue wool that complemented her dark eyes and brought out the auburn highlights in her brown hair. Seeing her dressed for company rather than work, Silas found himself revising his assessment of her appearance. She might not possess her sister's classical beauty, but there was something striking about her quiet elegance. "Mr. McGraw," Lydia said, inclining her head slightly, "this is unexpected." "Miss Whitmore," Silas replied, studying her face for any sign of the deception he half expected to find. Instead, he saw intelligence, wariness, and what might have been curiosity. "I was hoping we might have a conversation about the arrangement your father has proposed. If you're agreeable, perhaps we could take a walk in your garden." Lydia's eyebrows rose slightly at the suggestion. It was highly improper for an unmarried woman to walk alone with a man, especially in the evening. But then again, if they were truly to be married in 3 days, perhaps normal conventions no longer applied. "Allow me to fetch my shawl," she said. The Whitmore garden was Lydia's pride and achievement, though few people beyond the household staff ever saw it. Paths wound between carefully tended beds of vegetables and herbs, with sections devoted to medicinal plants she had cultivated through years of study and experimentation. A small greenhouse at the far end housed her more delicate specimens, and the entire space was enclosed by a white picket fence that created an intimate, private atmosphere. As they walked slowly along the main path, both Silas and Lydia seemed to be gathering their thoughts for a conversation that would determine the course of their futures. It was Silas who finally broke the silence. "Miss Whitmore, I believe we should be honest with each other about this situation," he said, pausing beside a patch of late-blooming roses. "I don't think either of us is under any illusions about your father's motives." Lydia turned to face him, moonlight catching the planes of her face and revealing an expression of quiet resolve. "No, I don't believe we are. The question is, what do we intend to do about it?" "That depends," Silas replied, impressed by her directness. "Are you a willing participant in your father's scheme, or another one of his victims?" The bluntness of the question might have offended another woman, but Lydia seemed to appreciate his candor. She walked to a small wooden bench positioned beneath an apple tree and sat down, arranging her skirts with practiced grace. "I'm certainly a victim of his indifference," she said finally, "but as for his scheme, I only learned of the marriage proposal this afternoon, and I've yet to see the full contract. However, I can guess at his intentions. Father has never done anything without calculating the profit involved." Silas joined her on the bench, maintaining a respectful distance while studying her profile in the moonlight. "Then why are you willing to go through with it?" Lydia was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the mountains, silhouetted against the starry sky. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of weary resignation, mixed with something that might have been hope. "Because at 26, Mr. McGraw, my alternatives are limited. I'm what polite society calls a spinster, and my prospects for marriage in this town died years ago. My father tolerates my presence because I'm useful in managing his household, but I have no illusions about my value to him beyond that utility. When he dies, my sisters will inherit everything, and I'll be dependent on their charity for the rest of my life." She turned to look at him directly, her dark eyes steady and unashamed. "You asked for honesty, so here it is. I'm plain. I'm too tall. I'm marked by smallpox scars, and I have opinions about things that women aren't supposed to think about, but I'm also intelligent, capable, and I know how to work hard. If you're looking for a wife who will be content to cook your meals and mend your clothes and ask no questions about your business, then I'm probably a reasonable choice." The matter-of-fact way she catalogued her perceived flaws struck Silas like a physical blow. Here was a woman who had clearly internalized every cruel whisper and dismissive comment she had endured over the years, yet she maintained her dignity and self-respect despite it all. "Miss Whitmore," he said gently, "I think you may be underestimating your qualities." A bitter smile touched her lips. "I'm 26 years old, Mr. McGraw. I stopped believing in fairy tales long ago." "I'm not talking about fairy tales," Silas replied. "I'm talking about what I've observed during my visits to this town. I've seen you help Mrs. Henderson with her shopping when her arthritis flares up. I've watched you read to the children at the schoolhouse with a patience that their own mothers often lack. I've noticed that your garden produces the finest vegetables anyone has seen, and I've heard that your preserves are sought after by every household in 3 counties. Lydia stared at him in surprise. "You've been watching me?" "Not watching," Silas corrected, feeling heat rise in his cheeks, noticing there's a difference. For the first time since he had known of her existence, Lydia Whitmore smiled, not the polite social expression she wore in public, but a genuine smile that transformed her entire face. In that moment, Silas began to understand that the town's assessment of her appearance was not only cruel, but fundamentally wrong. "Mr. McGraw," she said, her voice warmer than it had been all evening, "may I ask you a direct question?" "Of course. Why haven't you simply left town? You must know that my father's contract is designed to cheat you. A man with your experience wouldn't fall for such an obvious trap unless he had reasons of his own for agreeing to it." Silas leaned back against the bench, considering how much truth he was prepared to share with this remarkable woman. Finally, he decided that if he was asking for honesty, he owed her the same in return. "Because I'm tired of being alone," he said simply. 15 years in the mountains have given me financial security and a kind of peace I never found in civilization. But they've also given me a loneliness that's becoming harder to bear with each passing season. I find myself talking to my horses and my journal as if they were people, and I've started looking forward to my trips to town, not for the supplies I need, but for the simple sound of human voices. He paused, searching for the right words to explain feelings he had never articulated before. When your father made his proposal, my first instinct was to refuse. The contract is so obviously designed to cheat me that I was insulted by his assumption that I wouldn't see through it. But then I started thinking about you, about the woman who would supposedly be willing to marry a stranger for reasons she couldn't possibly understand. "And what did you think?" Lydia asked softly. "I thought that maybe we could be honest with each other in ways that your father never intended. Maybe we could build something real out of his calculated deception." The silence that followed was comfortable rather than awkward. Both of them lost in contemplation of possibilities neither had dared to imagine earlier that day. It was Lydia who finally spoke. "If we were to go through with this marriage, and I'm not saying we should, what would you expect from me?" "Partnership," Silas answered without hesitation. "Honesty, respect, the same things I would offer you in return. And if it doesn't work, if we discover that we're fundamentally incompatible, then we'll deal with that situation when it arises. But Miss Whitmore, I think we both understand that life rarely offers us perfect solutions. Sometimes we have to choose the best available option and work to make it better." Lydia stood and walked to the edge of the garden, where the fence opened, onto a view of the mountains that would soon become her home if she accepted Silas's implicit proposal. The peaks stood stark and beautiful against the star-filled sky, promising both adventure and hardship in equal measure. When she turned back to face him, her decision was evident in the set of her shoulders and the resolve in her dark eyes. "Mr. McGraw," she said formally, "if you're prepared to enter into a marriage based on mutual respect and honest partnership, then I accept your proposal. But I have conditions of my own that we need to discuss." The wedding ceremony took place on Saturday morning in the parlor of the Whitmore mansion, witnessed by a small gathering of curious townspeople who had come more to gawk than to celebrate. Lydia wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her taller frame, while Silas had purchased a new suit from the town's only tailor, a simple but well-made outfit of dark wool that complemented his rugged features. What surprised the guests most was not the unlikely pairing itself, but the demeanor of the bride and groom. Instead of the resigned desperation they had expected to see, both Silas and Lydia conducted themselves with quiet dignity and what appeared to be genuine mutual regard. When they exchanged vows, their words carried conviction rather than mere recitation, and when Silas placed a simple gold band on Lydia's finger, she smiled with what looked remarkably like happiness. The reception was brief, consisting mainly of polite conversation and wedding cake served on the Whitmore's finest china. Ezra Whitmore played the role of proud father with practiced ease, though his eyes held a calculating gleam whenever they rested on his new son-in-law. Victoria and Caroline Whitmore were gracious in their congratulations, though their perfectly composed faces couldn't entirely hide their bewilderment at their sister's transformation from unwanted spinster to mountain bride. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Silas helped Lydia load her modest belongings into a sturdy wagon he had purchased for the journey to his mountain home. Her possessions fit easily into 3 wooden crates and a leather traveling bag, a lifetime's accumulation that spoke eloquently of a woman who had never been encouraged to want much for herself. Hidden in the bottom of one crate, carefully wrapped in silk and oiled cloth, was Lydia's most precious possession, a leather pouch containing seeds and dried specimens from her garden, along with detailed notes about their cultivation and medicinal properties. The collection represented years of study and experimentation, knowledge she had acquired through correspondence with botanical societies and careful observation of local plant life. It was her hope chest, in a way, not filled with linens and silver like her sister's had been, but with the tools she would need to create a new life in the wilderness. The journey to Silas's cabin began in awkward silence, both newlyweds uncertain how to navigate this strange new relationship. The wagon rolled steadily along well-worn trails that gradually gave way to deer paths and then to routes that only someone with Silas's experience could follow. As the familiar landmarks of town disappeared behind them, replaced by increasingly wild and beautiful landscape, Lydia felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation that had nothing to do with her new husband's presence beside her. "Are you having second thoughts?" Silas asked quietly, noticing the way she kept looking back toward the valley that held everything she had ever known. "No," Lydia replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I'm having first thoughts, actually. I don't think I've ever made a decision this entirely my own before." As they climbed higher into the mountains, Silas found himself stealing glances at his new wife, trying to reconcile the composed woman beside him with the resigned spinster he had expected to marry. Lydia sat straight-backed on the wagon seat, her dark eyes taking in every detail of their surroundings, with an alertness that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. When they stopped to rest the horses beside a crystal-clear mountain stream, Lydia surprised him by immediately beginning to examine the plants growing along the water's edge. She moved with the purposeful efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for, collecting specimens with careful precision and making notes in a small journal she produced from her traveling bag. "Willow bark," she murmured, stripping a piece of bark from a tree with the ease of long practice. "And wild mint, both excellent for stomach ailments. Oh, and is that yarrow over there?" Silas watched in fascination as his new wife gathered her botanical treasures, her plain brown traveling dress becoming dusty and her hair escaping its careful pins as she worked. This was clearly a woman in her element, pursuing knowledge and skills that had been dismissed as unimportant by her family, but which could prove invaluable in their mountain home. "You know about medicinal plants?" he asked, genuinely curious. "I've been studying them for years," Lydia replied, carefully wrapping her specimens for transport. Mother thought it was an appropriate hobby for a spinster, useful enough to be practical, but not so interesting as to attract unwanted attention from men. The bitter note in her voice when she mentioned her mother's opinion struck Silas like a physical blow. How many interests and talents had this woman been forced to hide or diminish in order to fit her family's narrow expectations? "Well," he said carefully, "where we're going, practical skills are valued above social opinions. I'd be grateful for any knowledge you're willing to share." The smile she gave him in response was radiant, transforming her face in a way that made Silas understand why the town's assessment of her appearance had been so fundamentally wrong. Lydia Whitmore wasn't plain. She had simply been living in circumstances that dimmed her natural light. As they resumed their journey, the conversation between them began to flow more naturally. Silas shared stories of his years in the mountains, describing the wildlife and seasonal changes with the eye of someone who had learned to read the land like a book. Lydia asked intelligent questions and offered observations that revealed both her quick mind and her genuine interest in learning about her new environment. When they stopped for their midday meal, Lydia produced a basket of food she had prepared for the journey, not the dainty sandwiches and sweet cakes that might have been expected from a town lady, but substantial fare designed to sustain travelers through hard work. Fresh bread, aged cheese, dried fruit, and strips of salted beef were arranged with the same careful attention she brought to everything she did. "This is excellent," Silas said, genuinely appreciating both the quality of the food and the thought behind its preparation. "You planned this meal like someone who understands trail travel. I read everything I could find about frontier living," Lydia admitted, coloring slightly at the praise. "I wanted to be useful rather than burdensome." As they ate, Silas found himself studying his new wife with growing respect. Here was a woman who had approached their unconventional marriage with the same methodical preparation she brought to everything else in her life. She had researched, planned, and equipped herself to succeed in a situation that would have overwhelmed many women half her age. The afternoon brought them to increasingly rugged terrain, and Silas began to worry that the rough trails might be too much for someone accustomed to town living. But Lydia proved remarkably adaptable, bracing herself against the wagon's jolting with uncomplaining steadiness, and even offering to walk beside the wagon when the path became particularly challenging. "Are you sure you've never lived in the mountains before?" Silas asked, half-joking, as she deftly helped him navigate a particularly tricky stream crossing. "Never," Lydia replied, "but I've always believed in being prepared for whatever life might require." As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they finally reached Silas's mountain home. The cabin sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a view across a small meadow to the peaks beyond. Built of hand-hewn logs and chinked with clay, it was larger and more substantial than Lydia had expected, with a stone chimney that spoke of warm fires and cozy evenings. But it was the details that caught her attention. The carefully maintained vegetable garden, the neat stack of split firewood, the small workshop where Silas crafted the tools and repairs that mountain living required. This wasn't the rough camp of a temporary resident, but the established home of a man who had built a life of substance and meaning in the wilderness. "It's beautiful," Lydia said, and meant it completely. As Silas helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary on her waist, both of them felt the stirring of something that went beyond their careful negotiations about partnership and respect. The attraction was tentative and uncertain, but it was undeniably present, a spark of possibility that neither had dared to hope for when they agreed to this unconventional arrangement. That evening, as Lydia prepared their first meal together, in the cabin's well-appointed kitchen, while Silas tended to the horses and secured their belongings, both were surprised by how naturally they fell into domestic rhythms. When Silas produced a simple wooden comb he had carved during the journey, a small gift that acknowledged her femininity without presuming too much intimacy, Lydia's acceptance of the offering felt like the first step in a dance that might, with patience and care, become something beautiful. As they sat by the fire after their evening meal, sharing stories and tentative dreams for their future together, neither Silas nor Lydia could have imagined the trials that lay ahead. But they had taken the first crucial step in building something real from the artificial foundation of Ezra Whitmore's scheme. They had begun to see each other not as convenient arrangements or necessary compromises, but as partners worthy of respect, understanding, and perhaps in time, genuine affection. 3 weeks into their marriage, Silas and Lydia had established a rhythm of life that surprised them both with its natural harmony. Each morning brought new discoveries about their compatibility. Lydia's methodical approach to household management complemented Silas's practical wilderness skills, while his patient teaching helped her adapt to mountain living with remarkable speed. The transformation in Lydia was particularly striking. Away from the suffocating social expectations of prosperity, Greek, she had begun to flourish in ways that revealed the woman she had always been beneath her family's dismissive treatment. Her skin had gained a healthy glow from outdoor work and mountain air. Her movements had acquired the confidence of someone comfortable in her environment, and her eyes held a vitality that had been missing during her years as the Whitmore family's unwanted daughter. On this particular morning, as golden autumn light filtered through the cabin windows, Lydia was examining their dwindling supply of store-bought provisions when the sound of approaching horses interrupted her calculations. Through the kitchen window, she could see a lone rider picking his way carefully along the trail that led to their isolated home. "Silas," she called to her husband, who was splitting firewood near the cabin's front door. We have a visitor. The rider proved to be Tommy Morrison, a young man who worked as a messenger and occasional mail carrier for the businesses in Prosperity Creek. His horse was lathered with sweat, and his face bore the urgency of someone carrying important news. "Mr. McGraw," Tommy called as he dismounted. "I've got a letter for your wife. Came in on yesterday's stage from back east, and Mr. Whitmore said it was urgent enough to warrant special delivery." Silas accepted the envelope with a frown, noting the expensive paper and formal seals that suggested legal correspondence. The return address bore the name of a law firm in Denver, and the letter was addressed to Mrs. Lydia McGraw in a careful, clerk's handwriting. "Thank you, Tommy," Lydia said, emerging from the cabin with a cup of coffee and a plate of fresh biscuits for the tired messenger. "Please rest your horse and have something to eat before you head back down the mountain." As Tommy gratefully accepted the refreshments, Lydia examined the envelope with growing unease. Legal correspondence rarely brought good news, and the timing seemed particularly suspicious given her father's recent behavior and the hasty nature of her marriage. "Would you like privacy to read it?" Silas asked quietly, noting the concern. In his wife's expression, "No," Lydia replied firmly. "We agreed to be honest with each other about everything. Whatever this contains, we'll face it together." She opened the envelope with steady hands, though her heart was racing as she unfolded the document inside. The letter was written in the formal language of legal proceedings, but its meaning became clear as she read the carefully crafted sentences aloud. The law firm was writing to inform Mrs. McGraw that her father's extensive debts had come to light, following an investigation by his eastern creditors. Mr. Ezra Whitmore owed substantial sums to various parties, and his assets were being evaluated to determine what could be recovered to satisfy these obligations. As his daughter, Mrs. McGraw might have certain legal responsibilities regarding these debts, particularly those incurred before her marriage. But it was the final paragraph that revealed the true purpose of the letter. The firm had been engaged to examine the validity of certain property transfers and business arrangements that might have been designed to hide assets from legitimate creditors. Specifically, they were investigating whether Mr. Whitmore's daughter's recent marriage might have been arranged to transfer valuable mining claims and landholdings beyond the reach of debt collection. "They're suggesting that our marriage was designed to protect your father's assets," Silas said quietly after Lydia finished reading. "That you might be complicit in helping him hide his wealth from creditors." Lydia stared at the letter, her face pale with shock and growing anger. "He used me," she whispered, "even more completely than we realized. He didn't just want access to your land. He wanted to make it look like he had nothing left to seize." The implications were staggering. If the creditors could prove that the marriage was a fraudulent arrangement designed to hide assets, both Silas and Lydia could face serious legal consequences. Worse still, Silas's legitimate property holdings could be seized to satisfy debts he had no responsibility for. "There's more," Lydia said, her voice growing steadier as her initial shock gave way to cold fury. She had discovered a second sheet of paper tucked behind the first, a copy of the marriage contract her father had prepared, with notations in the margins that revealed its true purpose. The contract wasn't just designed to give Ezra Whitmore access to Silas's wealth. It was structured to make it appear that Silas had married into the Whitmore family's financial obligations. Carefully worded clauses would make him legally responsible for certain of Ezra's debts, while simultaneously transferring ownership of his own assets to his new wife, who was, conveniently, Ezra's daughter, and therefore subject to his influence. "He planned this for months," Lydia said, her hands trembling with rage as the full scope of her father's betrayal became clear. The timing, the urgency, even the way he presented you as a simple mountain man who wouldn't understand complex legal arrangements, it was all calculated to trap both of us. Silas took the documents from his wife's shaking hands and read through them again, his own anger building as he recognized the sophistication of the scheme. Ezra Whitmore hadn't just been looking for a convenient husband for his unwanted daughter. He had been looking for a wealthy Mark who could be manipulated into assuming responsibility for debts that would destroy any normal man. The question, now, Silas said grimly, is what we're going to do about it. Tommy Morrison had finished his meal and was preparing to depart, clearly sensing the tension that had settled over the McGraw household. Lydia thanked him again for his service and sent him on his way with additional provisions for the journey, but her mind was already racing through the implications of what they had discovered. As soon as the messenger disappeared down the mountain trail, Lydia turned to her husband with an expression of fierce determination that reminded him why he had been drawn to her strength of character. "Silas, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice carrying the conviction of absolute certainty. "I knew nothing about the extent of my father's schemes. I suspected he had ulterior motives for arranging our marriage, but I never imagined he would try to make you responsible for his debts or put your property at risk." "I know that," Silas replied without hesitation. "Anyone who spent 5 minutes in your company would know that you're incapable of such deception." The simple faith in his voice brought tears to Lydia's eyes, tears of gratitude for his trust and rage at her father's manipulation of them both. "Then you also need to know that I choose you," she continued, stepping closer to him with an urgency that spoke of more than mere partnership. "Not because I'm trapped in this marriage or because I have nowhere else to go, but because in 3 weeks you've shown me more respect and kindness than my family offered in 26 years. Whatever my father's intentions were, what we've built together is real, and I won't let his schemes destroy it." The declaration hung in the mountain air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond their original arrangement. For the first time since their wedding, both Silas and Lydia were acknowledging that their feelings for each other had evolved beyond mere compatibility into something deeper and more precious. "Lydia," Silas said, her name carrying a tenderness that made her heart race, "I need you to know that what I feel for you has nothing to do with your father's contracts or anyone else's expectations. These past weeks have shown me what real partnership looks like, and I wouldn't trade what we have for all the gold in these mountains." The emotional intensity of the moment might have overwhelmed them both, if not for the practical urgency of their situation. They had discovered a threat that could destroy not only their marriage, but their entire future, and they needed to act quickly to protect themselves. "We need to examine every document your father made me sign," Silas said, forcing himself to focus on immediate necessities. "And we need to understand exactly what legal obligations those papers might create." Lydia nodded, already moving toward the cabin's small writing desk where Silas kept his important papers. "I also need to write to some people in Denver, friends from my correspondence about botanical studies who work in legal offices. They might be able to help us understand what we're facing." As they spread the various contracts and agreements across the kitchen table, both Silas and Lydia began to appreciate the true sophistication of Ezra Whitmore's scheme. The documents were masterpieces of legal manipulation, designed to appear straightforward while hiding clauses that would gradually transfer control of Silas's assets to the Whitmore family. "Look at this," Lydia said, pointing to a seemingly innocent paragraph about mutual financial responsibilities in marriage. The language makes it sound like standard marriage provisions, but combined with this clause about property management, it could be interpreted to make you responsible for debts incurred by any member of my family. Silas studied the documents with growing admiration for his wife's analytical abilities. Her years of helping manage her father's business affairs had given her a sophisticated understanding of legal language that proved invaluable in dissecting the trap they had stumbled into. "There's something else," Lydia said, her voice taking on a note of grim satisfaction. "Father may have been too clever for his own good. Some of these clauses contradict each other, and there are provisions that could be used against him if we're careful about how we proceed As the afternoon wore on, their analysis revealed both the extent of their danger and the possibilities for fighting back. Ezra Whitmore's scheme was elaborate and well-planned, but it relied on several assumptions that were no longer true. Most importantly, the assumption that Silas was an ignorant mountain man who wouldn't understand what was happening until it was too late. "We need to get ahead of this," Silas said, as the sun began to sink toward the western peaks. "If we wait for your father or his creditors to make the next move, we'll be fighting a defensive battle we can't win." "Agreed," Lydia replied, her strategic mind already formulating plans. "But we also need to be smart about how we proceed. Father has resources and connections that we lack, and he's desperate enough to be dangerous." As they worked together late into the evening, developing strategies and contingency plans, both Silas and Lydia felt their partnership deepening into something that transcended their original arrangement. They were no longer just two lonely people who had found companionship. They were allies united against a common threat, and the trust they placed in each other had been forged in the fire of genuine crisis. The threat, represented by the legal documents, was real and serious, but it had also accomplished something that months of careful courtship might not have achieved. It had forced Silas and Lydia to declare their true feelings for each other and commit to fighting for their future together, whatever the cost might be. The first snow of the season arrived 2 weeks later, blanketing their mountain home in pristine white and effectively cutting them off from the outside world until spring. For most frontier couples, such isolation might have been a hardship, but for Silas and Lydia, it provided something they desperately needed: time to plan, prepare, and allow their relationship to develop without external pressures. During the long evenings by the fire, as wind howled through the pines and snow piled against their windows, Lydia worked on detailed maps of the surrounding territory. Her cartographic skills, developed through years of studying botanical distribution, patterns proved remarkably sophisticated. Each map showed not only topographical features, but also resource locations, seasonal water sources, game trails, and potential defensive positions. Information that could prove crucial if their legal troubles escalated into physical confrontation. "You've marked every cave and ravine within 20 miles, Silas observed one evening, studying her latest creation with admiration. "Where did you learn to survey land like this?" "Books, mostly," Lydia replied, adding careful notations to indicate timber, quality in different areas, and observation during our rides together. "I've always been good at seeing patterns and relationships that others miss." The maps were just one example of how Lydia had thrown herself into mastering every aspect of mountain living. She had learned to read weather signs with startling accuracy, could track small game through snow, and had developed an intuitive understanding of their land's resources that complemented Silas's years of experience. More importantly, she had begun to think strategically about their situation in ways that impressed her husband with their tactical sophistication. "If Father's creditors come looking for us in the spring," she said, spreading out her most detailed map, "they'll expect to find a helpless woman and an isolated mountain man. Instead, they'll be dealing with people who know this terrain better than anyone and have had months to prepare for their arrival." The transformation in Lydia during their weeks of isolation was remarkable. The timid, self-deprecating woman who had left Prosperity Creek had been replaced by someone who moved with quiet confidence and spoke with the authority of someone who knew her own worth. The harsh beauty of mountain winter had brought out a strength in her that years of town living had suppressed, and Silas found himself falling more deeply in love with her each day. The change was physical as well as emotional. Hard work and mountain air had given Lydia a vitality that made her previous appearance seem faded by comparison. Her dark eyes held a brightness that reflected her growing confidence, and her movements had acquired the efficient grace of someone completely comfortable in her environment. When she laughed, which happened with increasing frequency as their relationship deepened, the sound transformed their cabin into something warmer than any fire could provide. One evening in late November, as they worked together preparing preserved meat for the long winter ahead, Silas made a discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. While organizing the papers in his desk, he found a document that had been overlooked in their initial examination. Of Ezra Whitmore's contracts, a geological survey report that had somehow become mixed in with their marriage papers. "Lydia," he called, his voice carrying an urgency that brought her immediately to his side. "Look at this." The survey, dated several months before their marriage, detailed the mineral composition of the land surrounding Silas's cabin. According to the report, their property sat atop what geologists believed to be one of the richest gold deposits in the Montana Territory, a vein that could potentially yield millions of dollars in ore. "This is why Father was so determined to arrange our marriage," Lydia breathed, studying the technical diagrams with growing understanding. "He wasn't just looking for access to your existing wealth. He was positioning himself to control a fortune in gold that hasn't even been mined yet." The revelation explained everything. Ezra's willingness to arrange such an elaborate deception, the sophisticated legal contracts designed to transfer property rights, and the involvement of Eastern creditors, who had clearly been promised a share of future mining profits. But how did he get access to this survey? Silas wondered aloud. These geological reports are supposed to be confidential government documents. Lydia examined the survey more closely, noting the signatures and official seals that authenticated its contents. "Father has contacts in the territorial government, men who owe him favors or need his financial backing for their own ventures. Someone provided him with advance information about mineral deposits so he could position himself to profit from them." The implications were staggering. If the survey was accurate, the land that Silas had claimed through honest homesteading and years of hard work was worth more than either of them had imagined. But that same value made them targets for men who would stop at nothing to gain control of such wealth. "We need to hide this," Lydia said immediately. "If anyone discovers that we know about the gold deposits, we'll be in even more danger than we already are." As they concealed the survey among their other papers, both Silas and Lydia understood that their situation had fundamentally changed. They were no longer just dealing with Ezra Whitmore's schemes to escape his debts. They were sitting on a treasure that powerful men would kill to possess. The knowledge created a new intimacy between them, a shared secret that bound them together in ways their original marriage arrangement never could have achieved. That night, as they sat by the fire discussing strategies for protecting their claim and their lives, the last barriers between them finally fell away. "Silas," Lydia said quietly, her hand finding his in the flickering firelight, "I need you to know that whatever happens with the gold or my father's schemes, what I feel for you is real. I love you, not for what you can provide or protect, but for who you are." The declaration, spoken with the quiet sincerity that characterized everything about Lydia, filled Silas with a joy he had never expected to experience. He had entered their marriage hoping for companionship and found instead a love deeper and more sustaining than anything he had dreamed possible. "And I love you," he replied, bringing her hand to his lips with infinite tenderness. "Not because you were the only woman willing to marry a rough mountain man, but because you're the only woman I've ever met who could be my true partner in every sense of the word." The kiss that followed was their first as husband and wife who loved each other completely, without reservation or calculation. It marked the transformation of their arranged marriage into something genuine and precious, a partnership that would need all its strength to survive the trials that lay ahead. Outside their warm cabin, snow continued to fall, sealing them away from the world of schemes and greed that threatened their future. But inside, by the light of their fire and the warmth of their love, Silas and Lydia McGraw prepared for the battle they knew was coming, secure in the knowledge that whatever They would face it together. Spring arrived in the Montana Territory with sudden violence, melting snows, creating torrential streams, and washing away the peaceful isolation that had protected Silas and Lydia through the winter months. With the opening of mountain passes came the sound they had been dreading, multiple horses picking their way up the treacherous trail toward their cabin. From her position at the kitchen window, Lydia counted at least 8 riders, their faces grim and their saddles equipped with the tools of men prepared for trouble. Leading the group was a figure she recognized with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. Her father, Ezra Whitmore, looking older and more desperate than she had ever seen him. "He's brought armed men," she reported to Silas, who was checking his rifle near the front door. "And legal papers from the look of that leather satchel he's carrying." The confrontation they had spent months preparing for had finally arrived, but neither Silas nor Lydia felt ready for the emotional complexity of facing down her own family. The winter had given them time to plan defensive strategies and strengthen their legal position, but it couldn't prepare them for the pain of Ezra's ultimate betrayal. "Silas McGraw," Ezra called as the group came to a halt in front of the cabin, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to getting his way. "We need to talk about the serious legal issues surrounding your marriage to my daughter." Silas emerged from the cabin with calm deliberation, his rifle held casually but ready for use. Behind him, Lydia appeared in the doorway, her own weapon visible, and her stance making it clear that she stood with her husband against whatever her father intended. "Mr. Whitmore," Silas said evenly, "you're on my property without invitation, and you've brought armed men to threaten my wife and me. I suggest you state your business quickly and then leave." Ezra's face darkened at the implication that he was the intruder in this situation, but he controlled his temper with visible effort. The men beside him were clearly professionals, hired guns rather than local roughnecks, and their presence spoke to the seriousness of whatever scheme he was attempting to implement. "The business is simple," Ezra replied, producing a thick bundle of legal documents from his satchel. "My daughter's marriage to you was arranged under fraudulent circumstances, and these papers provide for its immediate annulment. Furthermore, certain property transfers that occurred as a result of the marriage are hereby declared invalid." Lydia stepped forward, her face pale, but her voice steady. "What property transfers, father?" "Silas owned his land and claims long before he met me." "That's where you're wrong, my dear daughter," Ezra said, and there was something almost triumphant in his tone. "The land your husband claims was never legally his to begin with. These documents prove that his original homestead application was filed improperly, making his claim invalid. As his wife, you have no legal standing to property that was never legitimately owned." The revelation hit both Silas and Lydia like a physical blow. If Ezra could prove that the homestead claim was invalid, they would lose not only their home, but any legal protection against his schemes to seize their assets. "That's impossible," Silas said, though uncertainty crept into his voice. "I filed all the proper paperwork through the Territorial Land Office 15 years ago, filed through agents who were later discovered to be corrupt," Ezra replied smoothly, clearly enjoying their distress. "The territorial government has been reviewing questionable land claims from that period, and yours was among those flagged for investigation. Fortunately, I was able to obtain advance notice of their findings." One of the armed men, a lean individual with cold eyes and the bearing of a former soldier, stepped forward with a document case of his own. "These are certified copies of the Territorial Land Office's findings," he said in a voice devoid of emotion. "Mr. McGraw's homestead claim is declared invalid due to procedural irregularities in the original filing." As Silas examined the papers with growing horror, he began to see the true sophistication of Ezra Whitmore's long-term planning. The corruption in the Territorial Land Office hadn't been a coincidence. It had been orchestrated, with certain claims deliberately processed improperly, so they could be challenged years later when the land proved valuable. You arranged this, Lydia breathed, her voice filled with incredulous rage. You corrupted the land office agents years ago, knowing that someday you might need to invalidate claims on valuable property. I planned for contingencies, Ezra admitted without shame. Business requires thinking several moves ahead, something you've never understood. But Lydia was no longer the intimidated daughter he had manipulated so easily. Months of mountain living and her growing partnership with Silas had forged her into someone capable of meeting his schemes with intelligence and determination. "Show me the geological survey," she demanded, extending her hand toward the armed man who clearly served as Ezra's legal representative. The man's slight hesitation before producing the document told Lydia everything she needed to know. The survey was identical to the one she and Silas had discovered in their papers, confirming that the gold deposits were not only real, but extensive enough to attract serious outside investment. "This is what you're really after," she said, holding up the survey for Silas to see. "Not just our land, but the mining rights to what could be one of the richest gold strikes in the territory." Ezra's mask of paternal concern finally slipped, revealing the cold greed that had driven all his actions. "The marriage was a business arrangement, Lydia. You knew that from the beginning. Now, circumstances require a different arrangement, one that serves the family's broader interests." "What family?" Lydia shot back, her voice carrying a fury that made even the armed men take a step back. "The family that treated me like an unwanted burden for 26 years? The family that used me as a pawn in your financial schemes? I have a family now, and it's the man standing beside me." The declaration hung in the mountain air like a battle cry, and for a moment Ezra seemed genuinely surprised by the transformation in his daughter. This was not the timid spinster he had married off to solve his problems, but a woman who had discovered her own strength and was prepared to fight for it. "Legal sentiments aside," the hired gunman interjected, "these documents give Mr. Whitmore clear authority to reclaim property that was illegally obtained and to dissolve a marriage that was based on fraudulent representations." Silas had been studying the legal papers with growing understanding, and his expression began to change from shock to something approaching satisfaction. "There's just one problem with your scheme, Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying a new note of confidence. "These documents assume that I'm the ignorant mountain man you expected to marry your daughter." He reached into his coat and produced a leather portfolio that neither Lydia nor Ezra had seen before. From it, he extracted a military service record, bearing impressive official seals and signatures. "Captain Silas McGraw, United States Army Corps of Engineers," he read aloud. "Veteran of the Civil War, decorated for service in military intelligence and strategic planning. Graduate of West Point Military Academy, class of 1852. The silence that followed was profound. Ezra Whitmore had built his scheme on the assumption that he was dealing with an uneducated frontiersman who could be easily manipulated through legal trickery. Instead, he was facing a man with formal education, military training, and 15 years of experience in surviving situations where intelligence was the difference between life and death. "I've been letting you think you were smarter than me, Whitmore," Silas continued, his voice carrying the authority of command that had once led men into battle. "But I've known about your scheme since before the wedding, and I've spent the winter preparing for exactly this moment." Lydia stared at her husband in amazement, seeing him clearly for the first time. The quiet mountain man she had married was actually a decorated officer who had chosen solitude not out of ignorance, but out of a deep understanding of human nature and its capacity for corruption. "Furthermore," Silas said, producing another document from his portfolio, "I took the liberty of having my original homestead claim reviewed by an independent legal authority in Denver. The so-called irregularities in my filing were actually deliberate alterations made after the fact by the same corrupt agents you bribed. My claim is not only valid, but has been officially confirmed by the Territorial Supreme Court. The hired gunman's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, but stopped when he found himself looking down the barrel of Silas's rifle. The mountain man's military training was evident in the speed and precision of his movement, and his eyes held the steady calm of someone who had faced death many times before. "Now then," Silas said conversationally, though his rifle never wavered, "I suggest you gentlemen collect your fraudulent documents and leave my property. And Mr. Whitmore, if you ever threaten my wife or attempt to set foot on our land again, you'll discover just how much I learned about dealing with enemies during my military service." The confrontation was over, but the real battle was just beginning. The retreat of Ezra Whitmore and his hired men brought no sense of victory to the mountain cabin. Only the grim knowledge that a desperate man with nothing left to lose would not accept defeat so easily. As Silas and Lydia watched the riders disappear down the treacherous mountain trail, both understood that the real confrontation was yet to come. "They'll be back," Silas said quietly, his military service medal catching the afternoon sunlight as he pinned it to his shirt. No longer a hidden reminder of his past, but a declaration of the skills he was prepared to use to protect his home and wife. "With more men and better plans," Lydia agreed, her analytical mind already working through the tactical implications of their situation. "Father won't make the mistake of underestimating you again." That evening, as they sat by the fire examining Silas's military records and decorations, Lydia began to understand the full extent of what her husband had hidden from the world and from her. The Congressional Medal of Honor spoke of heroism under fire, while commendations from generals praised his tactical brilliance in situations where conventional military thinking had failed. "Why didn't you tell me about your military background?" she asked, tracing the engraved details of his highest decoration with gentle fingers. "Because I came to the mountains to escape that life," Silas replied, his voice carrying the weight of old memories. "I'd seen enough of what men do to each other in the name of duty and honor. I wanted to build something clean and peaceful, away from the schemes and violence that seem to follow civilized society everywhere it goes. And instead, you married into exactly the kind of trouble you were trying to avoid," Lydia observed with bitter humor. "No," Silas corrected, taking her hands in his with infinite tenderness. "I married a remarkable woman who happened to have a scheming father. There's a significant difference." Over the following days, their mountain home transformed into something resembling a military headquarters, as Silas applied his strategic training to their defensive preparations. Using Lydia's detailed maps, he identified the best positions for observing approaching riders, planned fallback routes in case they needed to evacuate quickly, and established supply caches at strategic locations throughout their territory. Lydia proved an apt student of military tactics, her intelligence and methodical nature making her ideal for the kind of detailed planning that successful defense required. Together, they created overlapping fields of observation and prepared defensive positions that would force any attacking force to approach through carefully controlled routes. "Your father will hire professionals next time," Silas explained as they scouted potential ambush sites, men who know how to approach defended positions and deal with armed resistance. "We need to think several steps ahead of them. Then we need to know who he's hiring and what resources he has access to," Lydia replied. "I still have friends in town, people who might be willing to provide information about Father's activities." The intelligence gathering began immediately. Using a network of contacts developed through years of correspondence about botanical subjects, Lydia sent carefully worded letters requesting information about business activities in Prosperity Creek. The responses, when they came, painted a disturbing picture of Ezra Whitmore's desperate situation. Her father's debts were even more extensive than they had realized, involving not just Eastern creditors, but also some of the territory's most dangerous men. Individuals who had invested heavily in his mining ventures and expected substantial returns. More troubling still, He had apparently promised several different parties exclusive access to the same gold deposits, creating a web of conflicting obligations that could only be resolved through force. He's painted himself into a corner, Lydia observed as they studied the intelligence reports by lamplight. He owes more money to more dangerous people than he could pay if he owned every mine in Montana. The only way out is to deliver the gold deposits he's promised, which means taking our land by any means necessary. And if he fails, then some very unforgiving people will make sure he doesn't have the opportunity to disappoint them again, Lydia said grimly, which means he's going to throw everything he has at us, because it's literally a matter of life and death for him. The knowledge that they were facing not just Ezra's greed, but his desperation, added new urgency to their preparations. A greedy man might be willing to negotiate or compromise, but a desperate man would fight to the death rather than accept failure. As spring progressed into early summer, signs of surveillance began to appear around their property. Tracks in the soft earth near their perimeter, carefully concealed observation posts in the surrounding forest, and the occasional glint of sunlight off field glasses in the distance all indicated that professional watchers were studying their movements and defensive preparations. "They're being thorough," Silas noted with grudging professional respect. "Mapping our routines, identifying our strengths and weaknesses, probably trying to determine if we have any outside help we can call on." "Do we?" Lydia asked. "Have outside help, I mean?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, considering options he had hoped never to use again. Finally, he reached a decision that would have been unthinkable when he first retreated to the mountains 15 years earlier. "There are some men I served with," he admitted reluctantly, "veterans who might be willing to help if the situation becomes desperate enough. But calling on them would mean admitting that I can't protect my own home and wife, and it would draw them into a conflict that isn't their responsibility. Pride can be a luxury we can't afford," Lydia pointed out gently. "If Father brings professional gunmen against us, we might need professional soldiers to even the odds." The internal struggle was visible on Silas's face, the mountain hermit who valued self-reliance, warring with the military officer who understood the importance of adequate force strength. It was Lydia who resolved the conflict with characteristic directness. "Write to your friends," she said firmly. "Not to ask them to fight our battles, but to let them know we might need help. If the situation escalates beyond what we can handle alone, at least they'll be prepared to respond quickly." The letters were dispatched that very day, carried by trusted messengers to men scattered across the Western Territories, former soldiers who had found their own ways to build new lives after the war. The responses, when they came, were immediate and unequivocal. If Captain McGraw needed help, it would be provided without question or hesitation. But even as these reinforcements were being arranged, both Silas and Lydia understood that their real strength lay not in outside assistance, but in their partnership with each other. The winter months had forged them into a team that functioned with the seamless coordination of long-time military comrades, each able to anticipate the other's thoughts and actions with uncanny accuracy. "Whatever comes," Lydia said one evening, as they watched the sun set behind the mountains they both loved, "we'll face it together, and we'll win, because we have something worth fighting for that Father and his hired men will never understand." "What's that?" Silas asked, though he already knew the answer. "Each other," Lydia replied simply, "and a love that's real enough to be worth any sacrifice." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley. Not the careful approach of scouts or surveyors, but the deliberate advance of a force confident in its strength and intent on decisive action. The final confrontation was beginning, and both Silas and Lydia McGraw stood ready to defend everything they had built together, whatever the cost might be. Dawn was still an hour away when the attack began, but Silas and Lydia were ready for it. The mountain man's military instincts had detected the subtle changes in their surroundings, the absence of night sounds that indicated hidden watchers, the wrongness in the pattern of shadows that suggested concealed movement. He had wakened his wife with a gentle touch, and together they had taken their predetermined positions without a word being spoken. From her concealed position behind the cabin's stone foundation, Lydia watched through the pre-dawn darkness as figures moved with professional stealth toward their home. She counted at least 12 men, all carrying rifles and moving with the coordinated discipline of experienced fighters. These weren't the crude hired guns her father had brought on his first visit. These were military veterans, probably recruited from the same desperate circumstances that had driven other former soldiers to questionable employment. The signal mirror in her hands caught the faint starlight as she flashed a brief message to Silas, positioned in the timber 30 yards away. Enemy approaching from north and east, numbers confirmed. Ready to begin. Silas's response came immediately, the coded flashes they had practiced through long mountain evenings now serving their deadly purpose. Wait for first shot. Follow planned sequence. Trust the preparation. The attacking force moved. With impressive skill, using the natural cover of rocks and fallen logs to approach the cabin without exposing themselves to defensive fire. But their very professionalism worked against them, because Silas had anticipated exactly this kind of coordinated assault and had prepared accordingly. The first shot came not from the attackers, but from Silas himself, his rifle speaking with the calm precision of a marksman who had learned his trade in some of the war's bloodiest campaigns. One of the approaching figures spun and fell, and suddenly the pre-dawn quiet exploded into the controlled chaos of professional combat. Lydia's role in the defense had been carefully planned to make the most of her particular skills while keeping her as safe as possible. From her concealed position, she used the signal mirror to coordinate Silas's movement and provide information about enemy positions he couldn't see from his location. But more importantly, her rifle added a deadly second line of fire that turned their single defensive position into what appeared to be a coordinated defense by multiple shooters. Her first shot took down an attacker who had flanked wide to the east, trying to get behind Silas's position. The man fell with a cry of surprise that suggested the attacking force hadn't expected to face competent opposition from the supposedly helpless woman they were trying to intimidate. "Two down," she called softly, knowing Silas's trained ears would pick up her voice despite the gunfire. "Confirmed," came his reply. "They're regrouping behind the woodshed. Watch for movement on your left." The coordination between them was flawless, the product of months of preparation and a partnership that had been forged in trust and tested under pressure. They moved together like dancers, following familiar steps, each anticipating the other's needs and providing support without requiring instruction. The attacking force, despite their initial losses, pressed forward with the determination of men who understood the stakes involved. These weren't simple hired guns fighting for money. They were professionals who had been told that failure would result in consequences none of them wanted to face. "McGraw," called a voice from behind the woodshed, carrying the authority of command. "We don't want to hurt your wife, but we will if you force us to. Surrender now, and she'll be allowed to leave unharmed." Silas's answering shot, placed precisely through a gap in the woodshed's boards, suggested his opinion of such offers. The yelp of pain that followed indicated his message had been received and understood, but the attackers had resources beyond simple firepower. As the gunfight continued, Lydia noticed smoke beginning to rise from several points around their property. The enemy was attempting to burn them out, using fire arrows to set their outbuildings and fences ablaze in hopes of forcing them into the open. "Silas," she called urgently, "they're trying to fire the place." "I see it," he replied, his voice grim. "Time for the surprise we prepared." The surprise was a testament to both Silas's military engineering background and Lydia's methodical nature. Throughout the spring, They had prepared not just defensive positions, but also a series of carefully placed charges designed to create obstacles and confusion if they faced a coordinated attack. Silas's signal, 3 quick shots, followed by a pause, triggered Lydia's detonation of the first charge. The explosion brought down a large dead tree they had prepared, blocking the main approach route and forcing the attackers to expose themselves as they sought alternative paths forward. The psychological effect was as important as the tactical advantage. Suddenly, the professional gunmen found themselves facing opponents who had anticipated their strategies and prepared countermeasures that went far beyond simple defensive shooting. This wasn't the easy intimidation of frightened homesteaders. They had expected. This was a military-style defense conducted by people who understood warfare at a sophisticated level. "Fall back and regroup," ordered the enemy commander, his voice carrying frustration and growing respect for his opponents. These aren't ordinary settlers, but falling back proved more difficult than advancing had been. Silas and Lydia had prepared their defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire that made retreat under pressure a dangerous proposition. 2 more attackers fell as they attempted to withdraw to safer positions, their cries of pain and anger echoing across the mountain valley. From her concealed position, Lydia could see the attacker's leader clearly for the first time. A lean man with graying hair and the bearing of a career soldier. He was directing his men with the calm competence of someone accustomed to combat, but she could also see the uncertainty in his movements as he tried to adapt to a situation that wasn't developing according to his expectations. "Professional. Military," she called softly to Silas. "The leader knows what he's doing." "Confirmed," Silas replied. "But he's fighting the last war, not this one." The observation proved prophetic. As the morning light grew stronger, revealing the full extent of the defensive preparations Silas and Lydia had made, the attacking force began to show signs of demoralization. They had expected to face desperate civilians armed with hunting rifles. Instead, they were engaged in a tactical battle against opponents who had turned their mountain home into a fortress. The second prepared charge, detonated when the attackers attempted to circle around to the south, brought down a section of hillside that had been carefully undermined during the spring months. The landslide blocked another approach route while creating a dust cloud that provided cover for Silas to change positions without being observed. "How many charges do we have left?" he asked during a brief lull in the fighting. 3, Lydia replied, checking the carefully prepared detonation system they had installed. "But we should save them for when they make their final push." That push came sooner than expected. The attacking force's commander, recognizing that his initial strategy had failed, ordered a coordinated assault from multiple directions simultaneously. It was a desperate tactic that would either overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers or result in catastrophic losses for his own force. Lydia's marksmanship proved decisive in the chaos that followed. Her rifle, speaking with the deadly accuracy her husband had helped her develop, found its targets with mechanical precision. One attacker fell as he tried to rush the cabin's front door. Another dropped as he attempted to climb through a side window, and a third stumbled and rolled down the hillside when her bullet found him trying to gain an elevated firing position. The bloodied wedding ring on her finger, simple gold that had become a symbol of commitment forged in fire, caught the morning sunlight as she worked the lever of her rifle with practiced efficiency. This was no longer the timid woman who had accepted an arranged marriage to escape spinsterhood. This was a mountain woman defending her home and her love with lethal competence. "Silas," she called during a momentary pause. Movement in the timber to your right. His answering shot confirmed that her warning had been timely and accurate. The partnership that had begun as a business arrangement and evolved into love was now being tested in the crucible of combat, and it was proving stronger than either of them had dared to hope. But even the best preparation and most determined defense had limits. As the morning wore on and the attackers adapted their tactics to account for the sophisticated opposition they faced, Silas and Lydia both understood that they were approaching a critical moment. Their ammunition was limited, their prepared charges were nearly exhausted, and the enemy commander was beginning to coordinate his forces more effectively. "They're massing for a final assault," Lydia observed, watching through a gap in the cabin's log walls as the remaining attackers gathered behind the cover of the woodshed and outbuildings. "Then we make our stand here," Silas replied grimly. "Together, no matter what comes." The love in his voice, spoken in the midst of deadly combat, gave Lydia strength she hadn't known she possessed. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, she would face it as part of a partnership that had transformed them both from lonely outcasts into something greater than either could have been alone. The final assault came with the desperate fury of men who understood that failure meant more than professional disappointment. It meant facing the wrath of the dangerous people who had hired them. The surviving attackers, reduced now to 8 men, but led by their grimly determined commander, emerged from cover in a coordinated rush that was designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer audacity and speed. But they had underestimated both the tactical skill of their opponents and the power of love to inspire ordinary people to extraordinary acts of courage. As the attackers charged across the open ground toward the cabin, they ran directly into the most sophisticated defense that Silas and Lydia had prepared, a crossfire that had been calculated to create an inescapable killing zone. Lydia's rifle spoke first, her shot taking down the leftmost attacker before he had covered half the distance to their position. Her second shot, fired with the mechanical precision of countless hours of practice, dropped another man who was attempting to flank wide to the right. But it was her third shot that would be remembered by both of them for the rest of their lives. A desperate snapshot that saved Silas's life when an enemy rifleman drew a bead on him from an elevated position. The bullet that had been intended for Silas instead shattered harmlessly against the log wall behind him, while Lydia's return fire sent the would-be assassin tumbling from his perch among the rocks. The exchange lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it represented the culmination of everything their partnership had become. 2 people so perfectly attuned to each other that they could function as a single fighting unit. "Behind you," Silas called urgently, and Lydia spun to find an attacker who had somehow managed to reach the cabin's rear wall. Her rifle was empty, the lever action having exhausted its magazine during the fierce exchange of gunfire, but her response was immediate and decisive. The heavy iron skillet she had been using to prepare breakfast what seemed like days ago became a weapon in her hands, swung with all the strength that months of mountain living had given her. The impact sent the attacker reeling backward, dazed and weaponless, where Silas's follow-up shot ended his threat permanently. "How many left?" Lydia asked, frantically reloading her rifle with cartridges from the ammunition belt she wore across her chest. 3 plus their commander," Silas replied, his own weapon tracking movement among the burning outbuildings where the survivors had taken cover. "But they're not giving up." Indeed, the remaining attackers were regrouping for what everyone understood would be the decisive moment of the battle. The enemy commander, bleeding from a graze across his left cheek but still functioning effectively, was positioning his men for a final push that would either succeed in overwhelming the defenders or result in the death of everyone involved. It was at this moment of ultimate crisis that Lydia made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of continuing to fight from their prepared defensive position, she suddenly broke cover and sprinted toward the woodshed where the enemy had taken shelter, her rifle ready and her face set with grim determination. "Lydia, no!" Silas called, his voice filled with anguish at seeing his wife expose herself to such obvious danger. But Lydia had seen something during the battle that her husband had missed. One of their carefully placed charges remained unused. positioned directly beneath the woodshed where the enemy had concentrated their forces. If she could reach the detonation point, she could end the battle in a single devastating explosion. The run across the open ground seemed to take forever, though it lasted only seconds. Enemy bullets whined past her head and kicked up dust at her feet, but somehow none found their mark. Perhaps it was luck, perhaps it was the poor shooting accuracy of men under extreme stress, or perhaps it was something more. The protection that comes to those who fight for love rather than money. She reached the detonation point just as the enemy commander realized her intention and began shouting warnings to his men. But it was too late. Lydia's hand was already on the prepared charge's trigger, and her finger was tightening with the certainty of someone who had made peace with whatever consequences might follow. The explosion that followed was the loudest sound that had ever echoed across their peaceful mountain valley. The woodshed simply disappeared in a cloud of smoke and flying debris, taking with it the 3 men who had been sheltering behind its walls. The concussion knocked Lydia to the ground and left her ears ringing, but when the dust settled, she was still alive, and the immediate threat to their home had been eliminated. Of the enemy force that had attacked their cabin at dawn, only their commander remained alive, and he was badly wounded and disarmed. Silas approached the man with his rifle ready, but it was clear that the fight had gone out of him completely. "It's over," the commander said, his voice carrying the weary resignation of a professional soldier who had given his best effort and come up short. "Whitmore didn't tell us we'd be facing military opposition." "Ezra Whitmore hired you?" Silas asked, though the answer was obvious. "Him and others. Lot of money involved, lot of important people who wanted this land, but not enough money to keep. Fighting people who know what they're doing better than we do." Lydia, limping slightly from her rough landing, but otherwise unhurt, joined her husband beside the defeated enemy. The transformation in her appearance was remarkable. The proper town lady, who had left Prosperity Creek the previous year, had been replaced by a woman who looked entirely comfortable holding a rifle and covered in the dust and smoke of battle. "What? Will you tell the people who hired you?" she asked the wounded commander. "The truth," he replied with bitter honesty, "that they sent us to fight settlers and we found soldiers instead. That the woman they thought would be helpless proved to be as dangerous as her husband. That some battles can't be won, no matter how much money you throw at them." As Silas bound the man's wounds with the practical compassion of someone who had seen enough of war, both he and Lydia understood that they had won more than just a tactical victory. They had proven to themselves and to anyone else who might threaten them that their partnership was strong enough to survive anything the world might throw at them. The battle was over, but its consequences would reshape everything that followed. Ezra Whitmore's scheme had not only failed, it had failed so spectacularly that anyone else with designs on their land would think twice before attempting similar action. More importantly, Silas and Lydia McGraw had discovered that their love was not just strong enough to sustain them through ordinary hardships, but powerful enough to transform them into people capable of defending their dreams against any odds. As they stood together in the smoke-filled ruins of what had been a peaceful morning, surveying the evidence of their victory, both of them understood that they had crossed a threshold. They were no longer the lonely mountain man and unwanted spinster who had entered into a marriage of convenience. They were partners who had been tested in the fire of genuine crisis and emerged stronger than either had thought possible. 6 months after the battle that had transformed their mountain home into a fortress and their marriage into legend, Silas and Lydia McGraw sat on the porch of their rebuilt cabin, watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. The scars of combat had been carefully erased from their property, but the changes in themselves were permanent and profound. The legal aftermath of Ezra Whitmore's scheme had proven surprisingly swift once the territorial authorities understood the full extent of his fraudulent activities. The surviving attacker's testimony, combined with evidence found among the dead men's possessions, had exposed a web of corruption that reached far beyond one desperate father's attempts to escape his debts. Several territorial officials faced criminal charges. Multiple mining ventures collapsed when their illegal foundations were exposed, and Ezra himself had fled to Mexico rather than face prosecution for attempted murder and grand theft. More importantly, for Silas and Lydia, their property rights had been confirmed beyond any possible challenge. The gold deposits that had attracted so much criminal attention remained theirs to develop, or not, as they chose. They had decided, after much discussion, to leave the precious metal where nature had placed it, content with the wealth they had already discovered in each other. "I received a letter from Victoria today," Lydia said, holding up an envelope bearing her sister's familiar handwriting. "She wanted to know if we were planning to attend the territorial governor's reception next month." "And what did you tell her?" Silas asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "That we might consider it if they held the reception up here in the mountains, but that we weren't particularly interested in traveling to Denver just to make polite conversation with people who wouldn't have given us the time of day 6 months ago." The transformation in Lydia's social attitudes had been as dramatic as everything else about their new life together. The woman who had once accepted cruel whispers about her appearance with resigned dignity now possessed the confidence that came from being valued for qualities that actually mattered. She moved with the easy grace of someone entirely comfortable in her own skin, and her laughter, once a rare sound, had become one of the mountain's most beautiful features. Silas had changed as well, though his transformation was perhaps more subtle. The hermit's defensive solitude had been replaced by an openness to the world that reflected his contentment with the partnership he had found. He still preferred mountain isolation to town society, but it was now a choice made from strength rather than an escape born of disillusionment. "There's something I want to show you," Lydia said, disappearing into the cabin and returning with a leather portfolio that Silas hadn't seen before. Inside were detailed sketches, not the botanical drawings she was known for, but portraits. The first showed Silas as she saw him, not the rough mountain man that others perceived, but a man of intelligence and sensitivity whose eyes held depths that spoke of both strength and kindness. The second was a self-portrait that revealed how completely her self-image had changed. Gone was any trace of the plain, unwanted spinster, replaced by a woman who radiated confidence and inner beauty. But it was the third sketch that brought tears to Silas's eyes. It showed the two of them together, not as they appeared in any mirror, but as they appeared in the truth of their relationship. Two people who had found in each other the missing piece of themselves, creating something greater and more beautiful than either could achieve alone. "This is how I see us," Lydia said softly. "Not perfect by society's standards, but perfect for each other." "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Silas replied, and meant it completely. As evening deepened into night and the first stars appeared above the mountain peaks, they talked quietly about their plans for the future. There would be children, they hoped, who would grow up understanding that real beauty had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with character. There would be continued improvements to their homestead, projects that would benefit from both Silas's practical skills and Lydia's analytical intelligence. And there would be the quiet satisfaction that came from building something lasting together, far from the schemes and superficial judgments of a world that had never really understood either of them. "Do you ever regret it?" Silas asked as they prepared to go inside, "leaving your family and the life you knew to come up here with a stranger?" Lydia considered the question seriously, as she considered everything, then smiled with the radiance that had first made him understand how wrong everyone's assessment of her had been. "The only thing I regret," she said, "is that it took 26 years for me to find the one person in the world who could see me clearly. But I don't regret anything that happened after that. Not the arranged marriage, not your father's schemes, not even the battle that could have killed us both, because all of it was necessary to bring us to this moment, sitting here together as partners who know exactly what we mean to each other. And what do we mean to each other? Silas asked, though. He already knew the answer. Everything, Lydia replied simply. We mean everything. As they walked hand in hand into their home, a cabin that had become a fortress that had become a sanctuary, and a sanctuary that had become the foundation for a love story that would be remembered long after the gold in the surrounding mountains had been forgotten. Both Silas and Lydia understood that they had discovered something rarer and more valuable than any precious metal. They had found each other, and in doing so, they had found themselves. The mountain man who had married the supposedly ugliest daughter of a millionaire had learned that true beauty was not about appearance, but about character, not about social status, but about the capacity to love and be loved in return. And the woman who had been dismissed as plain and unmarriageable had discovered that she was, in fact, exactly what she had always been: remarkable, valuable, and worthy of a love as enduring as the mountains themselves. In years to come, when travelers passed through the territory and heard the story of Silas and Lydia McGraw, they would shake their heads in amazement at the tale of the unlikely couple who had built an empire of the heart in the wilderness. But those who knew them best understood that there had never been anything unlikely about their love. It had simply taken the right circumstances to reveal what had been waiting all along to be discovered. The mountains kept their secrets, but this one was too beautiful to hide forever. In a world that too often judged by appearances, Silas and Lydia McGraw had proven that the most profound transformations happen not in how we look, but in how clearly we learn to see.